coming. We have a great opportunity here to discuss a series of questions that are incredibly important around prisons. Today, as many of you will know, the prison has become a spectacularly significant thing around the world, and with very strange conditionalities and materialities in different conditions and regions. And in Latin America, it's always had a very strange figuration on islands and central to dictatorships and really significantly political. One of the people who has been most central to the discussion of prisons in Latin America is Máximo Sozzo, who I just learned has been studying them and going to them since last century. First published his first paper in 1996, he said. And I think what's really most significant about Máximo's work is that he has written about prisons from the region itself, which is to say, speaking very deliberately to the dynamics and contradictions, paradoxes, and very strange peculiarities that exist in prisons of the region themselves. So eschewing so much of the really dominant discussion in criminology that sees the prison as a very specific kind of palliative for life. And so what we see emerging from a lot of Máximo's work is really a larger conversation around what some people call southernizing the discussion, which is to say understanding the prison from a very different situated location. But the kind of critique and understanding, I think, really transcends so much when Máximo writes about it. So I was fortunate to meet him about 10 years ago, and we've seen each other a couple of times since then, mostly because he's now the Leverhulme visiting professor, which is a great position to have, a highly decorated position actually, and he's at Edinburgh. This is the last of the 3 years, I think, that he's going to be there. Each of those years, basically, he's brought together Latin Americanists working on prisons in the UK too, so a real consolidator, not just of ideas, but also of people. So really centrally important to the discussion, and if you appreciate these kinds of questions, I think you'll know exactly more about why in what we have here. So thank you very much for coming, and it's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Graham, Pedro, Paola, for the invitation. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming on this afternoon. So I will try to present today some thoughts connected with a new project that I have been working on since the beginning of 2024 with a group of colleagues from Spain and Canada. So at the end of the day, it's a comparative project that tries to transcend the frontiers between global north and south, if we still want to be attached to this kind of terminology. But in this paper, I will not make a lot of, let's say, comparative remarks at all. My paper is focused on Argentina. The more general project is around prison transparency, practices for producing knowledge about what is going on inside prisons, outside prisons, and producing actions in connection with this kind of knowledge in order to transform what is going on inside prison life. So this is the main topic of my talk today, but I will touch upon different kind of dimensions of prison life in connection with Argentina. So there will be many, let's say, possible discussions that could emerge out of this, and I am very happy to go back to them in the Q&A. So my point of departure is considering the growth of incarceration in Argentina. As in many other countries in Latin America, we have experienced in the last 3 decades very, very important growth. This is the incarceration rate in the country since the 1980s. There is a big period in which we don't have official data about the entire country. Argentina is a federal state like Brazil or Mexico. So we have not only one prison service or one prison system, but 24 different ones. So it's a very complex jurisdiction in terms of prison life, because what is going on inside prisons is not exactly the same in the federal prisons, that is one penitentiary service or one prison service, and in the other 23 prison services across the provinces. So we don't have information for this period. The transition to democracy starts here. So when the military dictatorship ends in Argentina, we had an incarceration rate of 90 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. Today, in 2023, we have 240 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. So this is the ranking of the incarceration rates in the different jurisdictions. Argentina is there, the blue one, but for 2022, not 2023, and including prisoners in police spaces. This is a very specific thing of different countries in Latin America. We have prisoners that are not incarcerated in prisons properly, but in police spaces that depend on police forces. So if we include them, the incarceration rate in 2022 was in Argentina 256, not 240, as the one I presented for 2023. We don't have a lot of information about that in the country till recently. That's why I present this graph of 2022. But you can see the huge level of variation of incarceration rate across jurisdictions. It's something that also happens in countries like Brazil. So we have scenarios. These are the biggest provinces in the country: Córdoba, Buenos Aires, Córdoba, Mendoza, and Santa Fe. So the incarceration rates are even higher than the national media. But we also have this: 100 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants, less than, let's say, England and Wales or Scotland. So a huge level of variation. Also a huge level of variation in terms of the evolution of the incarceration rate. I will not go in detail to this, but this is a comparison between 2002 and 2022 without prisoners in police spaces, because we don't have the data for 2002. But if we do this, we also see very crazy, let's say, differences in terms of the degree of growth of the incarceration rate in the country. I will talk mainly today about two jurisdictions of this very complex landscape of two jurisdictions. The prisons in the province of Santa Fe, that this is the fourth prison service in terms of the amount of prison population in the country. So this is the evolution of the incarceration rate since the 1980 till 2022. So we can see there also that the growth is always very strongly present at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s, and since then till now. And I will talk also about the federal prisons. There are prisons that incarcerated two types of offenders, so it's a very complicated prison population. There are incarcerated prisoners who committed or allegedly committed federal offenses. So, for example, illegal drug offenses are federal offenses in the country. But also, they are incarcerated there people who committed common offenses, non-federal offenses, but in the city of Buenos Aires. The city of Buenos Aires was originally a federal capital territory. Now it's an autonomous city since the mid-1990s. But people that are incarcerated because they committed, for example, a robbery or a homicide in the city of Buenos Aires, they end up in federal prisons. So these are the two main jurisdictions of which I will talk about. So in the context of this strong, albeit uneven growth in incarceration, certain long-standing problematics of prisons in Argentina have experienced a process of increase also, like overcrowding, degrading living conditions, institutional violence, violence between prisoners, reaching even paroxysmal levels today in some Argentinian jurisdictions. Again, we don't have to generalize easily, because also these different problems could be very different in different jurisdictions. However, as with the increase in the imprisonment rate, these different problems have grown as very, very important in the public and political debate. So in the last 20, 30 years, we have had a huge amount of public conversation and discussion about these kind of problems. Or see overcrowding, poor living conditions, institutional violence have been more or less present in the agenda of the public and political debate in the last 3 decades. So in some global north countries, in the context of neoliberal reforms, state institutions generated a language of transparency. So there are many examples of this across different kinds of public policies in different jurisdictions of the global north. And these discourses and practices of transparency were also in some way arrived to the prison systems. So in the case of Canada, this is very interesting because particularly the language of transparency is very present in the official rhetoric of particularly the Federal Correctional Service of Canada, and is translated in a flow of written information that is produced by the Federal Correctional Services with limited or no participation by external actors, generating a kind of partial and controlled visibility of what is going on inside prisons. This is combined with strong barriers to access to prisoners in Canadian prisons. So if you are, for example, a social researcher that wants to do interviews inside prison, this is a very difficult thing to do inside Canada today. So in general, these practices of transparency lack a strong contact with the lived experience of prison life, and this is strongly connected with the low level of permeability or porosity of Canadian prisons. So there is today in some jurisdictions of the global north, in the general projects in which this presentation in some way is located, in the case of Canada, there is an official language of transparency. So for example, if you want to know about suicides in the Federal Correctional Service today, you can file an action of request of official information, and you will get then a written dossier by the Correctional Service of Canada with a lot of information about it, but without giving any possibility for you to go inside prisons and try to contact the people who work or live inside prisons. So it's a type of transparency that I will label here official transparency. So the first idea that I want to transmit is that this kind of official transparency language is not present at all in Argentina. So the main huge difference in terms of comparison is that prison services are completely reluctant of any kind of language of transparency. And this is strongly connected with the fact that prison services are young state institutions in Argentina that were created in the 1960s and 70s, mainly in context of military dictatorships. The only exception is the Federal Prison Service that was created in 1947. And previously, these personnel who have been working inside prisons have had strong contact with police institutions. They were police officers. So many of the characteristics of contemporary prison services in Argentina are in some way connected with the characteristics of police forces in the country that were created during the 19th and the 20th century. Even today, some prisons in Argentina are formally under the control of police forces, particularly in the Patagonian region, that are small prison services. These prison services are not properly speaking prison services, but are departments inside the police forces of these different provinces, like Neuquén or Chubut. These prison services have been characterized by high doses of militarization. And this was strongly connected, of course, with the language of the internal enemy, with the doctrine of national security, and with the paroxysmal moment of the last dictatorship between 1974 and 1983, in which there was a massification of state crimes, but also prisons were part of this circuit of state terrorism. Transition to democracy in Argentina have not witnessed the production of structural reforms of prison services. There were some modest measures of reform in some jurisdictions with limited scope. There is only one exception of a process of reform that was more ambitious at the end of the 2000s in the province of Santa Fe, one of the jurisdictions that I will talk about it. But in general, there were not strong impacts of these different measures of reform in the different prison services. That in some way was as a consequence, has produced that many of the prison services continue to be strongly autonomous from elected officials. They have a lot of influence in policy making around prison life. In fact, they in some way guide politicians in the decision-taking processes around prison policy more than the other way around. This is strongly connected with authoritarian features of the culture of everyday of frontline prison officers. We have a bunch of quantitative and qualitative studies that have in some way show us this in the last 20 years. And this is strongly connected with the proliferation of authoritarian practices of control inside prison life, particularly through the use of violence. So in a way, this is strongly combined with the complete absence of a language of transparency, of official transparency in this prison service, and in fact with the production, the institutional production of opacity. So if you want to know how many suicides have been committed in a prison service in Argentina today, you will not find this kind of information in any of the web pages of the prison services. And if you ask for this information to the prison services, they will just didn't respond you, do not respond you. They will just do not say anything about it. So, but even considering all the things that I have rapidly summarized, and sorry for being so fast, and it's so difficult to be so fast in another language like English. So, but, well, the paper is trying to argue that despite all this, we can think of another kind of transparency that has been produced in the last decades in Argentina. Despite this persistent lack of transparency officially produced, and largely in response to it, in recent decades, there has been a process of multiplication and expansion of practices of different types of actors beyond the prison services, who produce information about what happens inside the prison walls and disseminate it to the public to a greater or lesser extent, questioning the legality and legitimacy of what is going on inside prison life. And these have been produced particularly in some jurisdictions in Argentina. There is a huge level of inequality in the development of these practices of another kind of prison transparency. But there are a plurality of external actors, some of which are part of the federal or provincial states, but others are social actors. In some cases, their practices are directly structured in relation to the objective of producing transparency, what I will label as direct transparency, or practices of the production of practices that want to produce the result of transparency and are directed to it. And in some other occasions, this happens even if the practices of these different kind of actors are not oriented directly to the object of producing transparency. They are doing different kind of things inside prison life, but they are producing transparency indirectly. In some cases, these practices are managed from above. They are produced by state actors of various kinds who embody a position of authority and have a legally established mandate and resources to produce this result. In other cases, these practices are produced from below by actors who do not have the status of authority, a mandate and legally established resources to produce this result. This may be the case even when these practices are carried out by state actors. I will talk a bit about public universities as actors of prison transparency in a minute. This will be a very interesting example, but also there are other actors that produce transparency from below that are social organizations. They are not part of the national or provincial states. So I will try to map these practices very briefly. It will be very difficult, but I will try. Considering particularly these two jurisdictions, the federal jurisdiction and the province of Santa Fe, that are the two jurisdictions in which I have been doing field work around this topic in the last year and a half. So at the federal level, for example, we have this National Penitentiary Ombudsman. The name in Spanish, many of you could understand Spanish, I imagine, Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación. Very strange name. Nobody knows why this name was the name for this public body that is, properly speaking, an ombudsman of the prisoners. So it has been created in 1993, but in 2003, there was a legal regulation of its activity, and he became part of the National Congress from 2003 onwards. And more recently, it has been transforming the local mechanism for the prevention of torture at the federal jurisdiction. The capacity of this public body has increased a lot in the last 3 decades. So now, for example, it has 11 regional delegations. There are 330 public employees working in this ombudsman body. They have different kind of practices. They do inspections of places of confinement that are unannounced. They receive telephone calls, free telephone calls from prisoners themselves. In all the federal prisons, in all the wings, there are public telephones in which you can phone directly to the telephone number of the Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación for free, and they have a system, a call center for all these phone calls from the prisoners, but also from their families. They began a practice of recording cases of torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, and practices of investigating and registering death in custody, 2 practices that are very interesting and quite different from other kind of ombuds-style bodies in other parts of the world around prison life and prison conditions. But they also, and this is very, very important, and I would love to talk more about it, they litigate cases. So they have a practice of judicial intervention using the habeas corpus action, but also, for example, promoting the criminal investigation of offenses by prison officials. And they have produced very interesting cases in the last, particularly 15 years. They also do annual reports and recommendations. Another public body at the federal level is the Ministry of Public Defense, that have a small body inside of it. These are the public defenders, the people who can defend all the people who are accused of committing a criminal offense without the pay, for free. So they are public employees. But there is this Prisons Commission who do also inspections and monitoring visits of different federal prisons. And they also produce a huge amount of litigation of cases connected with violations of rights of prisoners, using different kind of legal strategies. They also have a program for the registration of cases of institutional violence and particularly torture inside prison, as the Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación. And they also have a web of public defenders who are active in different federal prisons, because federal prisons are in Argentina diffused all over the territory, so there are in many different places. So there is a body that is quite similar in the province of Santa Fe, is the Provincial Public Service of Criminal Defense, where they have the same kind of practices. Very briefly, they do inspections, they also litigate cases, they produce also a register of cases of torture and other kind of ill treatment cases, very similar. And finally, we have the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture. Many of you are aware that the United Nations Convention on Torture have then been complemented by the facultative protocol, and the facultative protocol have promoted the creation of these kind of mechanisms all over the place, all over the states that are signatories of this treaty, this international treaty. So the UK, for example, have a National Committee for the Prevention of Torture in England and Wales, and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. The National Committee for the Prevention of Torture in Argentina is a specialized body with, again, public employees that do inspections, that do a lot of reports, that do a lot of recommendations, and have been quite important in several jurisdictions in which there are no local committees for the prevention of torture, local mechanisms for the prevention of torture, because in the 24 jurisdictions that we have in Argentina, we only have in 15 local mechanisms for the prevention of torture. So they produce different kind of actions, but in general they do not litigate cases. This is the main difference with all the other public bodies. So these are examples, and we can go back to them if you want, examples of practices of producing prison transparency from above by state bodies who have the authority and the resources, with funding from the public budget in order to produce transparency with different kind of practices, different kind of outcomes also. But these practices are only one part of the map of the practices of producing prison transparency, because there is another very important part that is what I would label as transparency produced from below. In this sense, I consider particularly the practices of public universities in Argentina who do things inside context of confinement. 34 of the 70 public universities in Argentina currently have initiatives within prisons, including 17 of the 24 prison services in the country. 16 universities offer degree courses for incarcerated students. This has been a process of multiplication, particularly in the last 10, 15 years. A very heterogeneous field with different modalities that have different scope, that have different outcomes. But all of them imply the constant flow of university actors in and out prison life. And this make possible the dissemination of information based on the lived experience of prisoners and direct encounters with them by external actors. There are some initiatives inside these programs that were directly aimed at producing the circulation of information. We have, an important amount of podcasts, radio shows, literature, painting, music that has been produced by this. But also we have initiatives that are more clearly politically oriented towards the transformation of prison life and are connected with the language of prisoners' rights. So these are two examples. We can go back to them in the Q&A if you are interested in these particular stories. I am very interested in both of them. One is the birth of an activity that continues today, but started in 1986, in the first moment of the transition to democracy. That is that prisoners who are students of law at the University of Buenos Aires in one federal prison, that is the male prison of the city of Buenos Aires, they develop this practice of legal counseling of other prisoners, so assisting them in producing different kind of actions in judicial terms. So this is a very interesting activity. And the other one that is very interesting again is the birth of a union of prisoners workers. Prisoners who work inside the federal prison services, a union that has started in 2013, still exists today. Today it's a very weak organization, but in the golden age of this union of prisoner workers, they have produced huge amount of effects, particularly in federal prisons and particularly in the federal prison in which it has been created. Both initiatives are strongly connected with the University Center of Devoto, CUD. Devoto is the name of the neighborhood in which this federal prison is in the city of Buenos Aires. But beyond the case of the universities, there has been a multiplication of social organizations working inside prisons and with and for prisoners. So in the province of Santa Fe, as an example, we have today many religious organizations, many evangelical churches. One development that has changed many things in prison life in many provincial prisons in Argentina is the birth of evangelical wings. We can talk about it if you like it. I am very interested in this, and I did research on this, and I have published a couple of papers on this. But also we have Catholic organizations, even the creation of an APAC, for the ones who are familiar with prisons in Brazil. Very interesting phenomenon, a phenomenon that an alternative to traditional prisons in Brazil that was promoted by a civil society organization called Asociación para la Asistencia y Protección de los Condenados, has been created in some jurisdictions in Argentina. One is the province of Santa Fe. They are fighting for building this kind of alternative prisons. They were not successful till now, but they are there and they are doing a lot of things. And then we have many social, sports and cultural organizations that do things inside prisons, from a club of football to feminist and even anti-carceral organizations who enter into the prison and do things with prisoners. This has been also in the last year experienced a process of strong support in some jurisdiction by public money. So it's quite interesting. This is the case of the Buenos Aires, the Santa Fe province, in which since 2017, a program from the Ministry of Social Development, not the Ministry of Justice, have funded many of these organizations to do things with prisoners. And this has been going on till now with differences, with some changes. But they have constructed these social organizations that do things constantly inside prisons. Many of them do not launch initiatives of an overtly political nature because they depend on public funding, so they have all the time the possibility of tensions and conflict with political authorities, with prison authorities, and they are quite aware of what to do and what not to do. But anyway, the flow of information that they are enabled to produce is quite strong and has been increasing in the last years. So we created in the province of Santa Fe, I mean we because I have been personally involved with this, we created a network of, we call it external actors who do things inside prisons, and we are putting together for the first time all these social organizations, but also all these public institutions that are not the prison service, putting together in a same room, discussing things about how we are doing things and how we can, in some way, enhance the capacity of doing things with prisoners, former prisoners there. So this map is quite complicated. So we have several practices of prison transparency produced from above that are intended to produce transparency. So these public bodies with public funding, with public employees, with legal mandates, but also we have these practices of producing prison transparency from above, from below, sorry, with actors that could be public, like the public universities, or could not be public, like social organizations, that in general, in many occasions, are not trying to produce transparency in their actions, but they produce transparency indirectly, doing other kind of things. So if I have to highlight something in all this very complex map, I would highlight two things. First, that is a prison transparency centered on prisoners and their voices. So prisoners have played a very important role in the edification, in the construction of all these practices in the last 3 decades. They have been all the time producing strategies to produce this kind of dissemination of information of what is going on inside prison walls and challenging the legitimacy and legality of what is going on. There are individual efforts, but also collective efforts. I mentioned the Union of Prisoner Workers. This is one example, but there have been other collective of prisoners that have been created in trying in some way to produce this kind of transparency. So, and even we can consider the constant use of measures to protest and demand things by prisoners themselves, from hunger strikes to riots, but in the middle, individual letters. That is a very, very common practice in prisons in Argentina. So prisoners' agency was central in constructing also the practices of these external actors. All of them have a direct contact with prisoners all the time, with lived experience. And I think that this is one feature that really, really is central or key in order to understand this very complex and diverse world of practices of producing prison transparency. And have been constantly trying to reverse the hierarchy of credibility that has always been created by prison and political authorities around prisons. So we don't believe prisoners. All these practices of transparency are based exactly on the opposite principle. They depart from voices of prisoners. And in general, have always been directed towards challenging what is going on inside prisons, its legitimacy, its legality. So it's completely the opposite of the official transparency that we could see in places like Canada. It's completely the opposite, because it's exactly the inverse kind of dynamic. So there have been quite interesting debates in the last 15 years, particularly English-speaking literature about counterviolence, watching the watchers, both around police practices and around prison practices. And I think that many of the things that are going on in this world of prison transparency practices in Argentina could be seen through this concept of counterviolence in many ways. And the other very important feature that I think is crucial is that these are practices of prison transparency in context of constant struggles. So it's an agonistic and contested production of transparency. Prisoners and external actors usually confront political and prison authorities and guards in their practices, in their everyday practices, trying to produce this knowledge about what is going on inside prison and trying to produce actions in order to change what is going on. This could have very different levels of intensity, and I have in mind many different examples, but I will not do it because I will not have time, of overt, even political conflict between some of these external actors and political authorities and prison authorities. Very clear, overt, public debates around these practices of producing prison transparency. But many, many, many times, this is produced more in a behind-the-scenes manner or modality, in which even, some images of cooperation between the actors could be created, but if you go beyond the surface, you will find the constant tension and the constant conflict. And of course, this is strongly connected, and I will go back to this at the end of my talk, in which things are getting much worse. So it's strongly connected with changes in political climates, and this is strongly connected with the different governmental alliances and their orientation in terms of penal policy. Prison authorities, prison guards are constant readers, very good readers of political climates, of public climates, and they took the result of this kind of reading all the time in consideration in deciding their practices in their everyday life. So they are, in this sense, they have this very interesting quality of reading what is going on in the public and political debate. I have now, in this moment of my talk, and it's 6 o'clock, so I already spent 45 minutes, I think, or so, 40 probably, so it's too much. So I planned to present you like a case study on this, that is a small thing, or not so small, but very interesting one, that I would like to label as a radical innovation, that is the authorization of the use of mobile phones inside some prisons, some jurisdictions in Argentina, a process that is very, very interesting from our perspective, and is one of the few positive effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, because this authorization began as a provisional one in some jurisdictions in the context of the closure of context of confinement, particularly the provision of visits. Visits, as you know, are very, very important for prisoners in emotional terms, but also in Argentina, as in many other Latin American countries, it's very, very important in terms of material support. It's crucial for the practices of survival. So those decisions in 2020 that closed the prison to visitors were contested by prisoners with many different strategies, from riots to collective petitions. And there has been in 2020 a public debate on how this could be handled. Very interestingly, one of the actors that I presented before, the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture, issued a recommendation to the prison services to authorize the use of mobile phones, like a compensation, at least of the emotional part of the things that the prisoners lost with the provision of family visits. And this has been produced in many of the jurisdictions in Argentina. Many prison services decided to authorize the use of mobile phones. So only 7 out of 24 prison services decided to continue to ban cell phones in that moment. And the Federal Prison Service and the Santa Fe Prison Service were the two of them were exceptions. They didn't authorize the use of cell phones, even as a temporary authorization. So I have been doing a research in another province, that is the province of Chaco, very poor province in the northern part of Argentina, with a medium-sized prison service, in which this temporary authorization was decided in 2020, but then in 2021 it has been transformed in a permanent authorization. So today in Chaco, every prisoner still have a cell phone, a mobile phone, and they could use it for many things in their everyday life legally. So mobile phones were transformed from a very, very key prohibited object in prison life in Argentina into an authorized device that has been labeled as a positive thing for prisoners. And this has produced huge amount of effects in prison life in general, but particularly on prison transparency. So I have been doing this field work. I will not go in detail about it, but just believe me that for all the prisoners, it has produced huge changes in terms of prison transparency. It has produced the reduction of situations of institutional violence in a very clear manner. It has produced new channels of communication with external actors, of course. So I have been in this fieldwork. I have been participating in meetings, Zoom meetings, every Tuesday at 9 o'clock p.m. with delegates of the different prisons of the Chaco prison service on a Zoom meeting. So it's quite fascinating. And discussing what is going on inside prisons in Chaco. And they invited people from the outside, many different people. In that case, I was invited once, and then I said, well, I could come back. So I did it once and again, so it was a fantastic. They have produced a huge impact in terms of collective organization today for prisoners in Chaco. But this is the other part of the story. After a series of media news about crimes committed using mobile phones from inside the prison, in the Chaco province, there was a huge public and political debate. I have to say that all the cases came from other provinces, not from the Chaco province. And the provinces where these cases came were provinces in which mobile phones were prohibited. But many political actors used this news in order to produce a law that again banned mobile phones. This has happened in April 2023. The governor in that moment decided to veto that law. That is a fascinating story. I could stay there for many more times, but jump in. And now there is a huge change in the political climate. As you know, in Argentina, we have a far-right federal government, President Milei. In the context of this new political climate, again, the provincial legislature sanctioned another law banning mobile phones. It's the same law as in 2023. But the thing is that still today, the law is not implemented at all. So those meetings at 9 o'clock in the evening on Tuesday continue to be held. Because there is a lot of resistances behind the scenes about this law, of course of prisoners, of course of human rights organizations and other social organizations, of course of monitoring bodies, but also from prison authorities. This is my favorite part. So I will try to now wrap up. So I am trying to describe in this paper a paradoxical trend. So there was an increase in the number of prisons, of imprisoned population in Argentina, proximal deterioration in prison conditions, but at the same time a proliferation and expansion of actors and practices for transparency in prison, both state and non-state actors, directly and indirectly, from below and from above, based on direct and unmediated contact with prisoners. But this could take us to a naive optimism. I am very far from that kind of disease, let's say. I live in Argentina today, so it's very difficult to be optimistic about anything. So the impact of this public and political climate today with the far right-wing government alliance and the renewed policy of mano dura, and we could talk about this more and more if you want, has produced a lot of impacts. One is the impact in this story, this small case study of the province of Chaco. There are many others. So we are witnessing many of these practices today that are put under risk in this context of this new climate, and there will be many more efforts that have to be done in the near future in order to sustain what we have accomplished in the last decades. Sorry for being so long. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was great. Excellent. Thanks very much.